Hey everyone, welcome back to A Day in the Life with Le. In today's episode, I'm getting my Bob Ross on and giving you guys an insight to how I create my actual paintings. So you'll get to learn about my layering, how I start from scratch, and tips on certain products and stuff that I use when creating my paintings. So let's get started. So one thing you might recognize in all of my work is texture. I've spoken about this before, but texture plays a very large part to my creative process. And so there are two types of mediums that I use. I use molding paste. Sometimes I use golden, sometimes I use Liquitex. I also use crackle paste. And what's awesome about these is that they help to create a nice layer of work. And they usually are like sometimes the foundation of my work before I start. So the first ones out of the two that I like to use is the molding paste. So I'm going to show you a little bit of how I kind of apply it on. So what's kind of awesome about molding paste, it has a very kind of creamy like texture, and I tend to use a palette knife. So I'll use sometimes a little bit or a bit of a slab, and depending on the focus of what I'm trying to do or make, it always determines the mood of how I move it around. And I like to kind of sometimes thin it out in places and then leave other places really thick and then make shapes. So molding paste is great for making shapes within your work if you'd like. I just like to give it to help me get movement in it. So sometimes I'll start big and build on it, or I'll just let it thin out and create these sort of like different looks to it. Now normally it can take a few hours to dry. If I'm doing any sort of texture before I start my work, I always like to give it 24 hours so it becomes a whole layering thing before you start. So after I'll put crackle paste on, the molding paste, I'll kind of rinse my brush or palette knife, as I say a little bit. And then I'll use the crackle paste. And so with the crackle paste, what's interesting about this one is that it has more of a moussey texture to it. Really moussey, which is kind of nice, and it's very light. And so what's cool about the crackle paste is that it depends on the consistency of how much of the medium you put on the canvas to how much you want it to crack, because the whole thing is that it's gonna crack as it dries. So sometimes I have it as like another sort of playmate along the molding paste, and I'll just put it right beside it. And similar to the molding paste, there are areas that I'll let be really thick, and then areas I'll thin out to help build more texture. Now I'm currently painting on a canvas panel and not a regular canvas for this particular example. So I'm going to layer some places that are thin, some places that are thick, and kind of puncture around with it. And like, for example, make it thicker here because maybe I want it to be more textured on this end. Leave it nice and thick so it kind of gives it. And of course, the more thicker you layer it on, the more it takes to dry. So it's always why I end up giving 24 hours, depending on what levels I put on there. So that's what I'm gonna layer on for this. Now, the fun part is, just because I laid the foundation of it doesn't mean I'm not going to add any more, because there's a very big possibility that I will add more texture even after it's dried. because I want to continue layering. My constant process is layering with my colors. All right, so to give you an example of what this looks like dried, I actually did a previous one before, just to give you guys an example. And so this is what it looks like dried. And I'm gonna switch this and put the wet one down so it kind of gets layering here. So now this is what it looks like dried. So I'm not sure if you can kind of see, for example, the crackles, but you can kind of see where I laid it on thick and you kind of see the crackles and then how thin the consistency between the two looks. Which is kind of cool. And so sometimes the next thing that I'll do, after I've kind of looked over the piece and kind of examined what I think I want done with it, I will kind of feel what sort of color situation I want with it. You know, what kind of colors do I want this piece? What am I trying to tell in terms of storyline? Now, for the sake of this, I actually want to show you guys how this looks like when I apply sort of paint on it and how the texture kind of plays into the canvas. So I'm going to use a sponge specifically. You can use an artist sponge or any sponge. I've used all different types. So now I've applied a little bit more and hopefully you can kind of see it, but I'm gonna bring it a little closer. You can kind of see how that gives a little bit of like, kind of a dimension to the piece a little bit. Oh yeah, there's a little bit of light where you can kind of see it, give it some layers. Which is nice because even with something like, you know, a canvas panel, which is, you know, pretty flat, you can still give a bit of dimension to the work. So another thing that will kind of happen is that whilst doing this, I'll see where the texture is still popping, but I would want to put more texture onto this later. For example, like with crackle paste half of the time sometimes, if I paint over it, you can still see it through the paint, but sometimes the crackles get lost. So what I end up doing is I end up relayering again and again because, put this on, I'm gonna add some yellow. Yeah, so it's 3 different sort of paints here, but different ways in which you'd see how the crackles and the molding paste kind of bring some dimension to it. So now, usually I would let that kind of dry a little bit longer or such, but let's say like I want more texture in this. There's not enough texture on this, I want more. Sometimes I could do it wet or dry, and I just add more molding paste on top of it. And what I love about working with acrylic paint is that the fact that it's dries pretty fast. And for someone like me that is constantly layering, like constantly, it's great. Because then I can just go back over with more. And even when it starts mixing with the paint, that's fine as well. But what's also nice is that you saw how it kind of came kind of translucent. So what will happen sometimes is that it will stay translucent even as I apply this. And sometimes if I apply color, you can still get some of the color that was underneath prior. So it kind of gives a little bit more of that layer dimension that's going on. So last time I had the molding paste here and some crackle off to the side, and now I'm going to relayer and put this crackle down here. And it doesn't matter that some color has gone into it, that's fine. Everything starts with the foundation, even with the color when I lay color on. Because nothing ever comes out to the way it originally is intended to be. And I'm layering it on a little thinner and thick like I did before to let this sort of stick out. So this is just the first stop of how I kind of began working and layering and starting my work. So I thought it'd be fun for the next couple of episodes to kind of show a little bit more insight to kind of a little bit of my painting process, a little bit more in depth, and giving you a more inside look into how I start this. So we're kind of going to use this piece that I've started showing you the foundation for to how I get there. So these next couple of episodes will kind of continue working on this piece so you can see how it comes about.